When the human voice disappears from the radio waves, when rescue helicopters turn into distant dreams, and when the wilderness becomes both prison and executioner, sometimes salvation comes through the crackling static of an old emergency frequency. This is the story of Sarah Chen, a wildlife researcher whose routine expedition became a fight for survival that would test every limit of human endurance. It's about the moment when hope seemed lost forever, until a voice from nowhere guided a military reconnaissance team through impossible terrain to reach someone who had already written her own obituary in the snow. This isn't just another survival tale. This is about the thin line between giving up and holding on, and how sometimes the difference between life and death is nothing more than keeping your radio on when everything else has failed. Sarah Chen adjusted her backpack straps for the third time that morning, feeling the familiar weight of research equipment pressing against her shoulders. The October air in the North Cascades carried that crisp bite that promised winter wasn't far behind, but for now, the mountain trails were still passable. At 28, Sarah had spent 6 years studying wildlife migration patterns, and this expedition to document the fall behavior of mountain goats was supposed to be routine. 3 days in, 3 days out, with enough supplies to last a week if weather delayed her return. She paused at the trailhead, checking her emergency radio one final time. The small device crackled with static before settling into silence. Standard protocol required checking in with base camp every 12 hours. And Dr. Martinez, back at the research station, had been clear about maintaining contact. Sarah clipped the radio to her belt, next to her GPS unit and emergency beacon. Technology was her lifeline out here, though she'd learned to trust her own navigation skills just as much. The trail started easy, winding through dense forest where Douglas firs created a natural cathedral overhead. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, stopping periodically to take photographs and notes about animal tracks and scat she encountered. Her research focused on how climate change was affecting traditional migration routes, and early evidence suggested the mountain goats were moving to higher elevations earlier each season. By noon, she'd covered 4 miles and reached the first elevation marker. The forest was thinning now, giving way to rocky outcrops and scattered alpine meadows. Sarah pulled out her lunch, a simple meal of energy bars and dried fruit, and tried the radio again. Static filled the air. But no human voices came through. She wasn't concerned yet. The mountains were notorious for dead zones, and she wouldn't reach the relay point until tomorrow. The afternoon brought her into true wilderness. The maintained trail gave way to game paths and rock scrambles, territory she'd navigated before, but always with respect for how quickly conditions could change. Sarah photographed several sets of goat tracks leading toward the higher peaks, exactly what she'd hoped to find. Her camera captured the stark beauty of the landscape, all granite cliffs and patches of snow that never fully melted even in summer. As evening approached, Sarah began looking for a suitable campsite. She needed level ground, protection from wind, and proximity to water. A small alpine lake, nestled in a cirque between 2 peaks, caught her attention. The area offered everything she needed, plus a commanding view of the surrounding terrain. She'd camped here once before, 2 years ago, during a survey of the area's plant life. Setting up her lightweight tent took 15 minutes. Sarah had done it hundreds of times, and muscle memory guided her hands even as her mind cataloged the day's observations. The mountain goats were definitely ranging higher than in previous years, and she'd seen evidence of earlier birthing seasons. Climate data was one thing, but seeing the changes firsthand gave her research real weight. With camp established, Sarah tried the radio again. This time she caught fragments of a conversation between 2 hikers somewhere in the area, their voices cutting in and out through the static. She made her scheduled check-in call, knowing it probably wouldn't get through but following protocol anyway. The GPS showed her position clearly, 17 miles from the nearest road and 43 miles from the research station. Dinner was a simple affair of freeze-dried pasta rehydrated with lake water she'd boiled and purified. Sarah ate while reviewing her notes from the day, sketching rough maps of the goat tracks she'd documented. The sun was setting behind the western peaks now, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that no photograph could truly capture. She'd seen countless sunsets in the wilderness, but each one still filled her with wonder. As darkness settled over the mountains, Sarah secured her food in a bear canister and prepared for sleep. The temperature was dropping quickly now, and she could see her breath forming small clouds in the beam of her headlamp. Weather reports before leaving had indicated clear skies for the next 3 days, with temperatures dropping but remaining manageable. She zipped herself into her sleeping bag, feeling confident about the progress she'd made. Sleep came easily despite the hard ground beneath her tent. Sarah had learned long ago to find comfort in the wilderness sounds. The subtle creaking of trees, the distant call of an owl, the whisper of wind through the peaks above. These mountains held dangers, but they also held a peace she'd never found anywhere else. She woke before dawn to the sound of wind battering her tent. Sarah lay still for a moment, listening to the intensity of the gusts. Weather in the mountains could change rapidly, but this sounded more severe than the light breezes predicted in the forecast. She checked her watch. 4:30 in the morning, still 2 hours before sunrise. Outside she could hear what sounded like precipitation, though whether rain or snow was impossible to tell from inside her tent. When Sarah unzipped her tent door to peek outside, she was met with a wall of swirling white. Snow was falling heavily, driven horizontal by wind that immediately numbed her exposed face.
This wasn't the light dusting that sometimes hit the higher elevations in early fall. This was a serious storm system, the kind that could dump feet of snow in a matter of hours.
Sarah quickly zipped the tent closed and reached for her radio. Static filled the small speaker, but no voices came through. She tried different frequencies, hoping to catch weather updates or contact anyone who might have information about the storm's duration. The radio remained stubbornly silent except for the hiss of electronic noise. Her GPS unit showed her position unchanged, but when she tried to access satellite weather data, the device couldn't establish a connection. The storm was interfering with signals, cutting her off from the electronic umbilical cords that connected her to the outside world. Sarah forced herself to remain calm and think through her options systematically. First priority was assessing her immediate situation. She had food for 6 days, longer if she rationed carefully. Water wasn't a concern with the lake nearby, though she'd need to melt snow if the surface froze. Shelter was adequate for now, but her lightweight tent wasn't designed for heavy snow loads. If the storm continued, she might need to dig a snow cave or find better protection among the rocks. The wind grew stronger as morning arrived without sunrise, the sky remaining dark gray through the swirling snow. Sarah could no longer see the lake that had been just 50 feet from her tent the night before. Everything beyond 10 feet in any direction was a white void. She'd experienced mountain storms before, but none with this intensity so early in the season. By what should have been full daylight, Sarah estimated at least 8 inches of snow had already accumulated around her tent. The wind continued to drive more snow horizontally, making it impossible to judge how much was actually falling versus how much was being redistributed.
There's a come on.
She tried the radio again, cycling through all available frequencies. On one channel, she caught a brief fragment of what might have been a weather report, but the signal faded before she could make out specific information. Sarah's training had prepared her for unexpected weather, but not for a storm of this magnitude. Every survival course emphasized the importance of staying put when visibility was zero, and she knew that attempting to hike out in these conditions would be suicide.
The trail she'd followed yesterday was probably already invisible under the snow, and the rocky terrain that had seemed manageable in good weather would become treacherous obstacles. She spent the morning reinforcing her campsite, using rocks to anchor her tent more securely and digging a small windbreak in the snow. The physical work helped keep her warm and gave her something constructive to focus on. Between tasks, she tried the radio repeatedly, hoping to catch any signal that might provide information about rescue operations or weather conditions. The storm continued through the day without any sign of weakening. By afternoon, Sarah estimated the snow depth at nearly 2 feet, with drifts much deeper in areas where the wind had piled it against obstacles. Her tent was holding up, but she could hear the fabric straining against the wind gusts. If the storm continued much longer, she'd need to consider alternative shelter options. As evening approached, Sarah faced a hard truth. This wasn't a typical mountain storm that would blow through in a few hours. Weather patterns suggested she might be trapped for days, possibly a week or more if this was part of a larger system. Her food would last that long, but only if she was careful. More concerning was the possibility that even when the storm passed, the snow depth might make hiking out impossible without proper winter equipment she didn't have. That night, Sarah lay in her sleeping bag, listening to the wind and trying to plan for multiple scenarios. Best case, the storm would clear tomorrow and she could hike out carefully, following GPS coordinates even if the trail was buried. Worst case, she'd be trapped until a rescue team could reach her, assuming anyone knew where to look. Her scheduled check-in wasn't until tomorrow evening, and Dr. Martinez wouldn't start worrying until she missed that contact. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to sleep, knowing that rest would be crucial for whatever challenges the next day might bring. Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the mountains, transforming the landscape into something alien and dangerous. She'd come here to study how animals adapted to changing conditions, never imagining she'd need to test her own adaptation skills so severely. The radio sat silent beside her sleeping bag, its antenna lost somewhere in the white void beyond her tent. Tomorrow, she'd try again to reach the outside world, but tonight, Sarah Chen was truly alone in the wilderness.
with only her training, her equipment, and her determination standing between her and the growing likelihood that this routine research trip had become something much more serious. The mountains that had welcomed her just yesterday now held her in a grip of ice and snow, and she was beginning to understand that getting home would require every ounce of skill and luck she could muster. Sarah woke to an eerie silence that seemed more ominous than the howling wind had been. For a moment she lay still in her sleeping bag, trying to process the absence of sound. When she finally unzipped her tent and looked outside, she understood why everything had gone quiet. The snow had stopped falling, but what she saw made her stomach drop. 3 feet of snow surrounded her tent, and in every direction the familiar landscape had vanished under a blanket of white. The rocky outcrops that had provided landmarks were now just vague humps in the snow. The lake she'd camped beside was completely frozen over and buried. Most troubling of all, the wind had sculpted the snow into deep drifts that would make any movement extremely difficult. Sarah's first priority was her radio. She'd missed her scheduled check-in the night before due to the storm. She extended the antenna fully and tried every frequency she could access. Static filled the speaker, occasionally broken by fragments of distant conversations, but nothing clear enough to establish two-way communication. The GPS unit offered mixed news. It could still acquire satellites and showed her position accurately, but when she tried to plan a route back to the trailhead, the elevation changes looked daunting. What had been gentle slopes yesterday were now potential avalanche zones with all the fresh snow. The device's weather function showed continued storm warnings for the region, with another system expected within 48 hours. Sarah forced herself to eat breakfast, though her appetite had vanished along with her visibility of the surrounding terrain. She needed to maintain her energy and think clearly about her options. Staying put seemed safest from a survival standpoint, but each day she remained meant less food and a smaller chance of rescue teams being able to reach her if the weather worsened. She decided to attempt a short reconnaissance hike to assess conditions and possibly find higher ground where the radio might work better. Sarah strapped on her snowshoes, essential equipment she'd brought as a precaution, and loaded her day pack with emergency supplies. The GPS coordinates for a nearby ridge suggested it was only half a mile away, though the terrain would make the journey much longer. The first steps away from her tent revealed how dramatically the storm had changed everything. Snow that looked solid collapsed under her weight, sometimes plunging her waist deep into hidden gaps between rocks. The snowshoes helped distribute her weight, but progress was exhausting. What should have been a 20-minute hike stretched into 2 hours of careful navigation through unstable snow conditions. When Sarah finally reached the ridge, the view both encouraged and terrified her. She could see for miles in every direction, confirming that the entire region was buried under the same heavy snowfall, but she could also see the dark clouds gathering to the west, suggesting another storm system was indeed approaching. The radio reception was slightly better here, and she caught fragments of what sounded like a weather report mentioning dangerous conditions and travel advisories. After several attempts, Sarah managed to establish brief contact with what sounded like a ranger station. The voice was broken and distorted, but she heard enough to understand that multiple rescue operations were underway throughout the region. She tried to transmit her position and situation, repeating her coordinates several times, but couldn't tell if anyone was receiving her signal clearly. The return trip to her campsite proved even more challenging. The route she'd broken through the snow earlier had already begun to drift over, and exhaustion was setting in, from the physical demands of snowshoe hiking in deep powder. Sarah had to rest frequently, using each pause to try the radio again. Most attempts yielded only static, but once she caught part of a conversation between search teams discussing grid patterns and helicopter availability. Back at her tent, Sarah faced a sobering assessment of her situation. The physical exertion of the morning hike had consumed significant energy, and she was already feeling the effects of the high altitude combined with the stress of her circumstances. Her food supplies would need to be rationed more carefully if she was going to be trapped much longer. More immediately concerning was the approaching weather system she'd seen from the ridge. As afternoon arrived, the wind began picking up again, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Sarah spent the time reinforcing her shelter and preparing for another night of severe weather. She used rocks and packed snow to create better windbreaks around her tent, and double-checked all her equipment to ensure nothing would be lost if conditions worsened. The radio continued to frustrate her with its inconsistent reception. She could occasionally pick up conversations between rescue teams, park rangers, and weather services, but her own transmissions seemed to disappear into the static without acknowledgement. The isolation was beginning to weigh on her psychologically as much as physically. Sarah had always been comfortable alone in the wilderness, but being unable to communicate her situation to anyone created a new kind of stress. That evening, the second storm system arrived with even more intensity than the first. Snow began falling again.
driven by winds that made her tent walls snap and flutter violently.
Sarah tried to sleep, but the noise and the constant movement of her shelter made rest nearly impossible. She found herself checking the time frequently, calculating how long her food would last, how long the storms might continue, how long it would take for rescue teams to organize and deploy. Around midnight, something changed with her radio. Instead of the usual static, she began picking up clearer signals, though still no responses to her own transmissions. She heard conversations between helicopter pilots discussing weather windows and landing zones. She heard ground teams reporting on snow conditions and avalanche risks. Most importantly, she heard her own name mentioned as part of a missing person report filed by Dr. Martinez. The knowledge that people were looking for her provided some comfort, but it also highlighted how difficult her rescue might be. The radio conversations made clear that multiple people were missing throughout the region, and resources were stretched thin. Helicopter operations were grounded due to weather, and ground teams were struggling with the same deep snow conditions that had trapped her. Sarah spent the rest of the night listening to radio traffic and trying to piece together information about rescue operations. She learned that the storm system was larger than initially predicted, covering hundreds of square miles with dangerous snow accumulations. Several avalanches had been reported, closing access roads and hiking trails. The weather forecast called for continued storms with brief, clear periods over the next week. By morning, Sarah had to acknowledge that she might be trapped for much longer than initially hoped. Her food supplies would last 4 more days at normal consumption, maybe 6 if she rationed carefully. The storms showed no sign of clearing completely, and even if they did, the snow depth would make hiking extremely dangerous. She needed to focus on survival rather than rescue, at least until conditions improved significantly. The third day brought a brief respite from the snow, though clouds remained heavy overhead. Sarah used the opportunity to improve her shelter and gather more information about her surroundings. The landscape continued to be unrecognizable under the deep snow, but she was able to identify a few distant landmarks that matched her topographic maps. During one of her regular radio checks, Sarah caught a transmission that made her heart race. A helicopter pilot was reporting successful extraction of 2 stranded hikers from a location she estimated was less than 10 miles from her position. The pilot mentioned challenging conditions but successful completion of the mission. If rescue helicopters were operating in the area, there was hope they might reach her too. Sarah immediately began trying to signal the helicopter crews, transmitting her position on emergency frequencies and explaining her situation. She couldn't tell if anyone was receiving her calls, but she continued broadcasting at regular intervals. The radio seemed to be working better now, possibly due to atmospheric conditions or her elevated position, but she still couldn't establish clear two-way communication. As the day progressed, Sarah heard increasing radio traffic related to search and rescue operations. Multiple teams were working the area, using both ground personnel and aircraft when weather permitted. She learned that several people had been successfully rescued, but others remained missing. The conversations revealed the massive scope of the operation and the challenges facing rescue teams. That afternoon, Sarah thought she heard helicopter rotors in the distance. She grabbed her emergency whistle and brightest clothing, preparing to signal if the aircraft came closer. The sound faded without the helicopter coming into view, but it confirmed that air operations were indeed active in her general area. She spent the rest of the day monitoring radio frequencies and preparing signal materials in case another opportunity arose. Evening brought disappointing news over the radio. Weather forecasts predicted another major storm system moving into the region, with conditions expected to ground all aircraft for at least 48 hours. Ground rescue operations would also be severely limited due to avalanche risks and visibility concerns. Sarah realized that her rescue would likely be delayed further, possibly by several more days. As she prepared for another night of uncertainty, Sarah took inventory of her remaining supplies. Food was becoming a serious concern, and she'd need to start rationing immediately. Water wasn't an issue with all the snow available, but melting it required fuel that was also limited. She had enough clothing to stay warm, but the physical and psychological stress of her situation was taking a toll. The radio crackled with ongoing search coordination throughout the night. Sarah listened to teams being repositioned, weather updates being shared, and rescue priorities being established. Her name appeared on the missing persons list being broadcast, along with her last known position and planned route. Knowing that people were actively searching for her provided some comfort, but the conversations also made clear how challenging her rescue would be. By morning, Sarah faced the reality that she might need to attempt self-rescue if conditions improved.
Waiting for help was becoming riskier as her supplies dwindled and her physical condition deteriorated from limited food and stress. The radio continued to be her only connection to the outside world, a lifeline that brought both hope and frustration as she struggled to make herself heard through the static and interference that seemed to swallow her desperate calls for help. The fourth morning brought Sarah's worst fears to reality.
When she woke, her tent was partially collapsed under the weight of fresh snow, and her water bottles had frozen solid despite being inside her sleeping bag. The temperature had dropped far below anything the weather forecasts had predicted, and ice crystals covered every surface inside her shelter.
Sarah's food supplies had dwindled to emergency rations that would last perhaps 2 more days. More concerning was her physical condition.
The combination of stress, limited food, and cold was affecting her coordination and decision-making abilities. She'd noticed herself becoming forgetful and having to concentrate harder on simple tasks.
These were early warning signs of hypothermia and malnutrition that couldn't be ignored. When she tried to use her radio that morning, the device wouldn't turn on initially.
Sarah panicked, thinking her lifeline to the outside world had failed completely. After warming the radio inside her jacket for several minutes, it finally responded, but the battery indicator showed critically low power. The solar charging panel she'd brought was useless under the heavy cloud cover, and she had no backup power source. The radio traffic she could monitor painted a grim picture of the ongoing rescue efforts.
Weather conditions continued to prevent helicopter operations, and ground teams were reporting extreme difficulty moving through the deep snow. Several other missing persons had been located, but some had been found too late. Sarah understood that time was running out, both for her personally and for the rescue team's ability to reach her. During one of her regular listening sessions, Sarah heard something that changed everything. A military voice was coordinating with civilian rescue teams, mentioning specialized equipment and personnel trained for extreme weather operations. The conversation was fragmentary, but she caught references to a reconnaissance team that had been deployed to assist with search efforts in her general area. Sarah immediately began transmitting on the frequency she'd heard the military coordination on, identifying herself and providing detailed position information. She repeated her GPS coordinates, described her condition and supplies, and explained the critical nature of her situation. The transmission seemed to go out clearly, but she received no immediate response. Hours passed with no acknowledgement of her calls, but Sarah continued broadcasting at regular intervals. She varied her transmission times and tried different frequencies, hoping to catch the military team when they were monitoring communications.
The effort was draining her radio's battery faster, but she had little choice if she wanted to establish contact before the device died completely. As afternoon approached, Sarah's radio crackled with a transmission that made her heart skip. A calm professional voice was calling for any station, and specifically mentioning her name and approximate location. The signal wasn't strong, but it was clearly directed at her. Sarah grabbed her radio and responded immediately, her voice shaking with relief and excitement.
"This is Sarah Chen. I'm receiving you. Please respond, over." Static filled the radio for several seconds before the voice came back, stronger this time. "Sarah Chen. This is Sergeant Rodriguez with Army Reconnaissance Team Alpha 7. We have your position and are moving to assist. What is your current condition, over?" Sarah could barely contain her emotions as she provided detailed information about her situation, supplies, and physical condition. Sergeant Rodriguez asked specific questions about her exact location, the terrain around her campsite, and any landmarks that might help the team navigate to her position. The conversation was professional but reassuring, the first human contact she'd had in days. "Sarah, we're approximately 8 miles from your position, but terrain conditions are challenging. We're equipped for snow operations and should reach you within 24 hours if weather permits. Conserve your energy and resources. Do you have adequate shelter for tonight, over?" Sarah confirmed her shelter status and remaining supplies. Sergeant Rodriguez provided specific instructions for conserving battery power, managing her food and water, and preparing for potential evacuation procedures. The team leader's calm confidence gave Sarah hope for the first time since the storms began. The radio contact continued intermittently throughout the day, with the reconnaissance team updating Sarah on their progress and providing encouragement. She learned that the team consisted of 4 soldiers with specialized mountain and cold weather training. They were equipped with advanced navigation systems, cold weather gear, and medical supplies, specifically deployed to assist with the most challenging rescue situations. That evening, Sergeant Rodriguez contacted Sarah with concerning news. The team had encountered a potential avalanche zone that would require careful navigation, possibly delaying their arrival. Weather forecast also showed another storm system approaching, though less severe than previous ones. The team would need to establish their own shelter for the night and continue their approach in the morning. "Sarah,
We need you to hang in there one more night.
We're committed to reaching you, but safety protocols require us to move carefully through unstable terrain. Can you confirm your shelter is secure for another night of weather? Over. Sarah assessed her tent and supplies honestly.
The shelter was holding up, though she'd need to be even more careful with her remaining food. The psychological boost of knowing help was coming made the physical hardships more bearable.
She confirmed her ability to survive another night and thanked the team for their efforts. Throughout that night, Sarah maintained sporadic radio contact with the reconnaissance team. They updated her on weather conditions, their progress through difficult terrain, and estimated arrival times. The conversations helped pass the long hours and kept her focused on positive outcomes rather than dwelling on her deteriorating situation.
Sergeant Rodriguez shared information about the broader rescue operations, explaining how the severe weather had created multiple emergency situations throughout the region. Sarah's case had been prioritized due to her extended time in the field and the challenging nature of her location.
The team had volunteered for the mission despite the difficult conditions and long approach required. As morning arrived, Sarah woke to the sound of her radio crackling with urgent communications.
The reconnaissance team was reporting that they'd navigated through the avalanche zone successfully and were making good progress toward her position. Weather conditions were improving, with clearing skies and reduced wind. Estimated time of arrival was early afternoon. Sarah spent the morning preparing for the team's arrival and potential evacuation. She packed essential items and organized her gear for quick departure if necessary.
The radio conversations indicated that immediate evacuation might not be possible due to continuing weather concerns, but the team was prepared to establish a more secure shelter and provide medical assistance. Around noon, Sarah heard voices calling her name from somewhere in the distance. She grabbed her emergency whistle and began signaling while responding on the radio. Within minutes, she could see 4 figures moving through the snow toward her campsite, their military gear and purposeful movement clearly identifying them as the rescue team. Sergeant Rodriguez reached her tent first, a compact man with weathered features and kind eyes that immediately assessed her condition. Behind him came 3 other soldiers, all carrying heavy packs and moving with the easy confidence of experienced mountain personnel. The relief Sarah felt at seeing other human beings was overwhelming, and she had to fight back tears. "Sarah Chen, I presume?" Sergeant Rodriguez said with a slight smile. "You've been through quite an ordeal. Let's get you checked out and figure out our next steps." The team's medic, Corporal Williams, immediately began assessing Sarah's condition, while the other soldiers evaluated her campsite and the surrounding terrain.
Sarah was dehydrated and showing early signs of malnutrition, but her core temperature was stable and she was alert and responsive. The medic provided electrolyte supplements and additional food while explaining that her condition was serious but not critical.
Sergeant Rodriguez used his advanced communication equipment to contact base operations and provide an update on Sarah's condition and the team's status. The radio was far more powerful than Sarah's emergency device and immediately connected with rescue coordination centers. Weather reports indicated that helicopter evacuation might be possible within 12 to 18 hours if conditions continued to improve. The reconnaissance team established a more robust shelter system around Sarah's campsite, using military-grade equipment designed for extreme conditions. They shared hot food from their rations and provided additional warm clothing to help Sarah regain her strength. The professional efficiency of their operations was reassuring after days of uncertainty and isolation. As evening approached, Sergeant Rodriguez explained their options. Weather conditions were improving, but helicopter evacuation would require a suitable landing zone that didn't exist at their current location. The team could either wait for perfect conditions and risk another storm, or begin moving Sarah toward a predetermined evacuation site roughly 6 miles away. The movement would be challenging given your current condition, but we have equipment to assist and the route is feasible with proper support. Staying here means gambling on weather windows that might not materialize.
What are your thoughts over? Sarah considered her options carefully. She was weak and tired, but the idea of ending this ordeal as quickly as possible was appealing.
The reconnaissance team clearly knew what they were doing, and she trusted their assessment of the risks and benefits. After discussing the plan in detail, she agreed to attempt the movement to the evacuation site.
The team spent the evening preparing for departure, checking equipment, planning rest stops, and coordinating with Rescue Operations Center about the evacuation timeline. Sarah tried to rest, knowing she'd need every bit of energy for the challenging hike ahead. The radio crackled with ongoing coordination between multiple agencies working to complete her rescue. For the first time in days, Sarah fell asleep knowing that her survival was no longer dependent solely on her own resources and determination. The reconnaissance team's arrival had transformed her situation from desperate survival to organized evacuation. The voice that had whispered through the static had become real human beings, committed to bringing her home safely, though the most challenging part of her ordeal was still ahead. Sarah woke before dawn to the sound of careful movement around the campsite. The reconnaissance team was preparing for what Sergeant Rodriguez had warned would be the most dangerous part of their operation.
Moving a weakened person 6 miles through unstable snow conditions required precise planning and constant vigilance for changing weather and terrain hazards. Corporal Williams checked Sarah's vital signs again while she ate a carefully portioned breakfast designed to provide energy without overwhelming her compromised digestive system. Her blood pressure was low and her coordination remained affected by days of stress and limited nutrition, but the medic declared her stable enough for movement with proper support and frequent rest breaks. The team had spent much of the night studying satellite imagery and topographic maps to plan the safest route to the evacuation site. Sergeant Rodriguez explained that they would need to navigate through 2 potentially hazardous areas: a steep descent through loose snow that could trigger small avalanches, and a traverse across an exposed ridge where wind could create dangerous conditions. "We'll rope you to me for the technical sections," Sergeant Rodriguez told Sarah as they prepared to depart. "Specialist Jackson and Private Martinez will break trail ahead of us while Corporal Williams follows behind to monitor your condition. We'll move slowly and stop whenever you need rest. The key is maintaining steady progress without pushing beyond your limits." Sarah's gear had been redistributed among the team members to minimize the weight she'd need to carry. Her pack now contained only essential personal items, emergency supplies, and water. The soldiers carried everything else, including her research equipment that had originally brought her into the mountains. The soldiers met his wife. The team moved with the efficient precision of professionals executing a well-rehearsed plan. The first mile proceeded smoothly through relatively stable snow conditions. Sarah found the movement therapeutic after days of forced inactivity, and her strength seemed to return gradually as her circulation improved. The team maintained constant communication through hand signals and whispered commands, never losing track of each other or their position relative to potential hazards. When they reached the steep descent that Sergeant Rodriguez had identified as the first major challenge, the team's pace slowed considerably. Specialist Jackson, the team's mountain warfare expert, went first to test the snow stability and establish the safest line of descent. Private Martinez followed, then Sergeant Rodriguez with Sarah roped securely to his harness, and finally Corporal Williams maintaining constant observation of Sarah's condition. The descent proved every bit as treacherous as anticipated. Several times, small sections of snow gave way under their weight, sending chunks cascading down the slope below them. Sarah's legs shook from exhaustion and fear as they navigated around exposed rocks and across sections where the snow barely covered dangerous gaps. The rope connecting her to Sergeant Rodriguez became her lifeline as she struggled to maintain footing on the unstable surface. Halfway down the slope, Corporal Williams called for a halt. Sarah's breathing had become labored, and she was showing signs of altitude sickness combined with her existing weakness. The team established a temporary rest position wedged against a large boulder that provided protection from both wind and potential snowslides. Sarah accepted additional fluids and medication while the team reassessed their route and timeline. "The good news is we're making better time than expected," Sergeant Rodriguez reported after consulting with his teammates. "The bad news is the weather window might be smaller than we hoped. Helicopter operations are reporting increasing winds at elevation, and we may need to reach the evacuation site sooner than planned." The team resumed movement with renewed urgency, though they continued to prioritize safety over speed. The remaining portion of the steep section required careful navigation around a series of rock outcrops that had been scoured clean by wind, leaving patches of bare ice between snow-covered areas. Sarah's confidence grew as her body adapted to the movement and the team's support systems proved their effectiveness. When they finally reached more level terrain, Sarah felt a surge of accomplishment mixed with growing exhaustion. They'd successfully navigated the most technically challenging section, but she could feel her energy reserves depleting rapidly. The team's medic continued monitoring her condition while they moved, checking pulse and responsiveness at regular intervals. The second major challenge came as they approached the exposed ridge traverse. Wind speeds had increased significantly, and visibility was beginning to decrease as clouds moved in from the west. The team could see their destination in the distance, a relatively flat area where helicopters could land safely, but reaching it would require crossing nearly a mile of exposed terrain with no protection from the elements. Specialist Jackson scouted ahead to assess conditions while the rest of the team sheltered in a depression that provided temporary wind protection. When he returned, his report was sobering. Wind speeds across the ridge were approaching dangerous levels, and snow was beginning to blow horizontally, with enough force to create whiteout conditions. The weather window for helicopter evacuation was closing rapidly. Sergeant Rodriguez made radio contact with rescue coordination to update them on the team's position and the changing conditions. The conversation was difficult to follow through the static and wind noise, but Sarah caught enough to understand that helicopter operations were being suspended due to deteriorating weather. The team would need to either wait out another storm or continue to an alternate evacuation site much farther away. "We're going to push across the ridge," Sergeant Rodriguez decided after consulting with his team.
Conditions will only get worse if we wait, and Sarah doesn't have the reserves for a longer route. We'll rope together as a team and move quickly while visibility allows.
Everyone stay close and follow my lead exactly. The ridge traverse tested everyone's limits. Wind gusts threatened to knock them off their feet, and blowing snow created periods where they couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. Sarah found herself completely dependent on the rope system and Sergeant Rodriguez's steady guidance as they navigated across terrain she couldn't see clearly. Her feet were becoming numb despite her boots, and she struggled to maintain the pace required to reach safety. Halfway across the ridge, Private Martinez reported seeing what appeared to be a break in the clouds to the east. The observation proved accurate, and within minutes they could see patches of blue sky and sunshine breaking through the storm system. More importantly, they could hear the distinctive sound of helicopter rotors somewhere in the distance, though the aircraft wasn't yet visible. The team pushed harder toward their destination as the weather continued to improve incrementally. Sarah drew on reserves she didn't know she still possessed, driven by the proximity of rescue and the knowledge that conditions might deteriorate again at any moment. Corporal Williams moved closer to provide additional support as her coordination began to falter from exhaustion and exposure. When they finally reached the evacuation site, Sarah collapsed onto her knees in the snow, overwhelmed by relief and physical exhaustion. The area was exactly as described, a relatively flat, wind-protected depression large enough for helicopter operations.
The team immediately began preparing the landing zone while Sergeant Rodriguez established radio contact with incoming aircraft. Rescue Helicopter Charlie 7. This is Ground Team Alpha 7.
We have the package at designated LZ. Request immediate evacuation due to deteriorating weather conditions and medical concerns.
Over. The helicopter pilot's response was clear and reassuring. Ground Team Alpha 7. This is Charlie 7.
We have visual on your position and are beginning approach. Prepare for immediate departure.
Estimated on ground time 2 minutes. Over. Sarah watched through exhausted eyes as the helicopter appeared over the surrounding peaks, its rotors creating swirling clouds of snow as it descended toward their position. The aircraft was larger than she'd expected, clearly designed for search and rescue operations in challenging conditions.
As it settled into the landing zone, crew members jumped out to assist with loading procedures. The helicopter crew included a flight medic who immediately took over Sarah's care from Corporal Williams.
While the reconnaissance team secured their equipment and prepared for departure, Sarah was loaded onto a stretcher and given initial medical assessment. Her condition was stable but required immediate attention at a medical facility for dehydration, malnutrition, and possible frostbite.
As the helicopter lifted off from the mountain landing zone, Sarah looked down at the terrain they'd crossed during their challenging journey. The snow-covered landscape that had been her prison for nearly a week now appeared beautiful rather than threatening, seen from the safety of the aircraft.
The reconnaissance team sat quietly nearby, their mission accomplished despite the numerous obstacles they'd overcome. During the flight to the medical facility, Sarah reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in less than 24 hours.
The voice that had first whispered through her radio static had materialized into real people willing to risk their own safety to ensure her rescue. But this is the book of the static in the second. The victims of the past decades have died. You have 26 men since dead. The 2-2 went into the cabin.
The helicopter touched down at a regional medical center, where additional medical personnel were waiting to provide comprehensive care. As Sarah was transferred to the emergency department, Sergeant Rodriguez appeared beside her stretcher for a final conversation before the team departed for their next assignment.
You did great out there, Sarah, he said with genuine admiration. Your preparation and determination kept you alive long enough for us to reach you.
Take care of yourself and maybe consider some different research locations for a while. Sarah managed a weak smile and thanked him and his team for literally saving her life. As she was wheeled into the medical facility, she could hear the helicopter preparing for departure, carrying the reconnaissance team back into the mountains, where other people might need their specialized skills and unwavering commitment to bringing everyone home safely. The emergency department at Valley Regional Medical Center was a stark contrast to the wilderness Sarah had called home for the past week.
Bright fluorescent lights, warm temperatures, and the constant hum of medical equipment created a sensory overload after days of wind, snow, and silence.
Jennifer Park, the attending physician, began immediate assessment while nurses worked to address Sarah's dehydration and hypothermia. Blood tests revealed the full extent of Sarah's ordeal.
Her electrolyte levels were dangerously imbalanced. Protein markers indicated significant muscle breakdown from inadequate nutrition, and her core temperature was still 2 degrees below normal despite the helicopter's heated cabin. Most concerning were signs of early-stage frostbite on several toes, though Dr.
Park was optimistic about avoiding permanent damage with proper treatment. "You're lucky to be alive, Dr. Joe,"
Park told Sarah as warm intravenous fluids began restoring her body's chemical balance. "Another day or two in those conditions, and we'd be looking at much more serious complications."
The rescue team got to you just in time. Sarah's first phone call was to Dr. Martinez at the research station. Her supervisor's relief was evident even through the poor cell connection, and his voice broke slightly as he described the anxiety of the past week. Search and rescue coordinators had briefed him on the challenges facing rescue teams, but hearing Sarah's voice confirmed what he'd hardly dared to hope during the darkest moments of the operation. "The entire department has been worried sick," Dr. Martinez told her.
"We've been following the rescue operations and knew you were alive, but not being able to help was torture. Take all the time you need to recover."
"Your research can wait, but we can't replace you." As Sarah spent her first night in the hospital, she found herself repeatedly awakening in panic, thinking she was still in her tent listening for the radio or checking for signs of another storm. The psychological impact of her ordeal was becoming apparent even as her physical condition stabilized. Dr. Park had warned her that recovery would involve more than just addressing the immediate medical concerns. The next morning brought visitors that surprised and moved Sarah deeply.
Sergeant Rodriguez and Corporal Williams appeared in her hospital room, having driven 4 hours after completing their mission debriefing. The reconnaissance team had wanted to check on her progress and ensure their efforts had achieved the desired outcome.
Their presence provided a connection to the experience that helped her process what had happened. "We wanted to make sure you were getting proper care," Sergeant Rodriguez explained. "Rescue operations don't really end until we know everyone is fully recovered. Plus, Williams here was worried about those toes of yours." Corporal Williams examined Sarah's feet with the same professional attention he'd shown during their mountain journey. The frostbite damage was minimal, responding well to gradual rewarming and circulation therapy.
The medic's satisfied assessment removed one of Sarah's major concerns about long-term consequences from her ordeal. During their visit, Sarah learned more about the broader rescue operation that had saved her life.
7 people had been reported missing during the unprecedented storm system, and all had been successfully located and rescued. The reconnaissance team had been specifically deployed for the most challenging cases, using their specialized training to reach people in locations where normal rescue teams couldn't operate safely.
"Your case was actually one of the more straightforward ones," Specialist Jackson revealed when he joined the group later that afternoon. "We had your exact coordinates and clear radio contact. Some of the others required extensive search operations just to locate them. The radio work you did was textbook perfect for guiding us in." The comment made Sarah realize how crucial her emergency radio had been, not just for receiving help but for providing the precise information needed for a successful rescue. Her decision to continue broadcasting even when she couldn't hear responses had created the beacon that allowed the team to find her in the vast wilderness. The voice in the static had been whispered in both directions.
Dr. Martinez arrived that evening with a small group from the research station bringing flowers, books, and updates on the ongoing work that had temporarily lost its lead investigator.
Sarah's research notes and camera equipment had survived the ordeal intact, saved by the waterproof containers she'd insisted on using despite their extra weight. Her data about mountain goat behavior patterns would contribute to important climate change research.
"I've been analyzing your preliminary notes," Dr. Martinez told her. "The observations about elevation changes in goat populations could be the key finding we've been looking for. Your work was more valuable than you realized, even before this survival story overshadowed the science."
Sarah's parents flew in from Seattle the following day, their faces showing the strain of a week spent fearing the worst while hoping for good news. Her mother, a nurse herself, understood the medical information being shared but struggled with the emotional reality of how close she'd come to losing her daughter. Her father, typically stoic, broke down when he saw the frostbite damage and realized the seriousness of what Sarah had endured. The hospital stay stretched to 5 days as doctors addressed various complications from prolonged exposure and malnutrition. Sarah's appetite returned gradually, though she found herself hoarding food and checking repeatedly to ensure water was available.
Sleep remained difficult, interrupted by dreams of snow and wind and the constant need to verify that she was truly safe and warm. Physical therapy began on her 3rd day, focusing on restoring strength and coordination that had been compromised by her ordeal.
The therapist Maria Santos had experience working with outdoor enthusiasts who'd encountered serious wilderness emergencies. She understood both the physical and psychological challenges Sarah faced in recovering her confidence along with her capabilities. "Your body remembers being in survival mode," Maria explained during one session. It's going to take time for your nervous system to accept that the crisis is over. The physical exercises help, but you also need to process the emotional trauma of what you experienced. Dr. Well-Forced. Dr. Gumbo. Park arranged for Sarah to meet with a counselor who specialized in trauma recovery for people who'd survived life-threatening situations. The first session focused primarily on helping Sarah understand that her emotional responses were normal reactions to abnormal circumstances. The counselor, Dr. Rebecca Chen, had worked with military personnel, disaster survivors, and others who'd faced extreme stress.
Survival situations create lasting changes in how your brain processes threats and safety, Dr. Chen explained.
The hypervigilance and anxiety you're experiencing served you well in the mountains, but now you need to learn to turn those responses down to normal levels. As Sarah's physical condition improved, she found herself thinking more about the broader implications of her experience.
Climate change had created the unusual weather patterns that led to her near-fatal situation, but it had also driven the migration changes in mountain goats that her research was documenting. The personal and scientific aspects of her work had become intimately connected through her ordeal.
Media attention began building as word of the dramatic rescue spread through local and eventually national news outlets. Sarah was reluctant to discuss her experience publicly while still processing it personally, but she recognized that her story might help other wilderness researchers understand the importance of emergency preparedness and communication protocols. When Sarah was finally discharged from the hospital, she faced decisions about her future that she'd never anticipated making. The experience had shaken her confidence in wilderness fieldwork, but it had also reinforced her commitment to research that could help mitigate the environmental changes creating more dangerous conditions for both wildlife and humans. Dr. Martinez offered her the option of focusing on laboratory analysis and data interpretation for the immediate future, avoiding field research until she felt ready to return to wilderness settings.
Sarah appreciated the support but wasn't ready to make long-term decisions while still recovering from her ordeal. 3 weeks after her rescue, Sarah attended a debriefing session with search and rescue coordinators, sharing insights that might help improve future operations. Her detailed account of radio procedures, equipment performance, and decision-making under stress provided valuable information for training programs and equipment recommendations. Sergeant Rodriguez and his reconnaissance team were recognized for their exceptional performance during Sarah's rescue and the broader search operation.
Their willingness to undertake dangerous missions in extreme conditions had saved multiple lives, and their professional competence had made the difference between successful rescues and potential tragedies.
We're implementing new protocols based partly on how your rescue developed. You helped save not just your own life, but potentially others in future emergencies. As autumn progressed toward winter, Sarah found herself drawn back to her research but approached it with new respect for the power of natural forces and the importance of comprehensive safety planning.
Her survival experience had given her insights into animal adaptation strategies that couldn't be gained from any academic study, adding depth to her understanding of how climate change was affecting mountain ecosystems. The voice that had whispered salvation through the radio static had been more than just Sergeant Rodriguez and his team. It had been the culmination of training, technology, institutional support, and individual determination that created the system capable of reaching her in her desperate situation. Sarah's survival had depended on all these elements working together, from her own preparation and decision-making to the specialized skills of professional rescuers who'd risked their own safety to bring her home. 6 months later, Sarah returned to the mountains for the first time since her rescue. The location was different. The season was spring rather than fall, and she was accompanied by a full research team rather than working alone. But as she adjusted her radio and checked her emergency beacon, she remembered the lesson that had been whispered through static in her darkest hours. Sometimes survival depends not just on your own strength, but on your ability to reach out through the void and trust that someone will answer when everything else has failed.
No backup, no hope, until her radio whispered survival to a daring recon team.